Well, thanks again for coming today. I'm going to, this is going to in certain ways build on the talk that I gave yesterday about sort of the way institutions often emerge, at least in some ways, as you'll see. But it also grows out of a long-term philosophical interest I've had in the concept of pragmatism and the pragmatist approach to knowledge and life. So in this talk, I want to reflect on the growing interest in social experimentalism in the areas of public policy and institutional choice. The underlying idea of experimentalism in social settings is not a new one. For example, it has formed the basis of one of the primary justifications for federalism as a system of governance. But there's been a renewed interest in the benefits of social experimentation that is worthy of careful consideration. The interest is manifest in a number of ways. On the one hand, it underlies the movement that has been building, at least in the States, among other places, for the idea of evidence-based public policy. It started in the area of healthcare and has moved on to other areas there, where the focus is on actually evidence-based decision-making. On the other hand, it's instantiated an array of local and regional projects that attempt to develop new approaches to traditional economic and political problems. Now, while there's been substantial interest and advocacy for the principle of social experimentalism, there's been considerably less attention given to the question of how such experimentalism can be conducted effectively. Here, what I have in mind by effectiveness relates to the capacity of the social experimental process to create the proper testing necessary to produce reliable information that the members of a community will deem persuasive. The problem with much of the existing literature is that too many policy and institutional projects are conceptualized and assessed as the product of social experimentalism, when they in fact emerge from different, less effective processes. The normative implication of this is that we thus attribute the value that would normally result from effective experimentalism to social projects that have not been effectively tested. A classic example of this is the attribution of value to policies and institutions that have survived the test of time. I want to put that in quotation marks. The test of time interpretation of events rests on the logic of social experimentation. It's a claim that the relevant policy in question, whatever it might be an institution, it might be some way of handling a policy problem, that the relevant policy has continued to perform effectively in the face of ongoing challenges. When this process has transpired in a context in which the experimentalism has been effective, then the attribution of value is appropriate. But when the process has been to varying degrees ineffective, then the attribution doesn't follow, and the justification of the continuing use of the policy or institutional practice in terms of the test of time criterion is not supported. And basically what I mean here is that people, you know how people often talk about, well, that's a tradition we have, and we've used this tradition for a long time, and there's a reason why we should continue to do it, because if it weren't a good thing, it would have collapsed by now, or it wouldn't persist over time in terms of that. So that's the basic idea. Now, to consider these questions, I want to draw on some recent work that I've done with Jim Johnson in a book called The Priority of Democracy, that addresses the relationship between pragmatism and democracy. Now, pragmatism is a fruitful perspective, we think, from which to think about social experimentalism. Not only does it recommend an experimental approach to social life, but it also provides a framework for conceptualizing the task of making experimentalism effective. In pursuing this analysis, I want to follow the recommendations of an American pragmatist, John Dewey, who explained, quote, that the business of political philosophy and science is to aid in the creation of methods such that experimentation may go on less blindly, less at the mercy of accident, more intelligently, so that men may learn from their errors and profit from their successes. In this regard, social and political theory performs a critical function by assessing the merits of existing social practices. And it performs a constructive function by proposing both new methods of social inquiry and new institutional arrangements. So let me say a little bit about pragmatism. Pragmatists see the social and natural world as fraught with contingency. As a result, even our most fundamental beliefs inevitably will be called into question and potentially proven false. What is important is how individuals and communities respond to the resulting tensions and strains, to the real doubt that unforeseen contingencies generate. Peirce famously identified several ways of settling beliefs: the methods of tenacity and of authority, the a priori method, and the method of science. And while he himself insisted that the majority of mankind would forever resolve doubt via the method of authority, he insisted that the experimentalism central to science afforded the surest way to fix or settle belief. For experimentation represents the most reliable way of generating solutions to problematic situations. And we assess the results of properly conducted experiments in terms of their actual or anticipated consequences. Now, I take this commitment to be general, in the sense that it applies, for example, not just to theoretical concepts, but to public policies and to social, economic, and political institutions as well. Now, although contemporary pragmatists will disagree vigorously on this question about whether pragmatism has any explicit political implications, Dewey was quite explicit that his philosophical commitments were relevant only insofar as they had political implications. In a relatively early, properly philosophical essay, he reflexively applies the pragmatic rule to the pragmatist conception of truth. And he concludes, quote, "If the pragmatic ideal of truth has itself any pragmatic worth, it is because it stands for carrying the experimental notion of truth that reigns among the sciences, technically viewed, over into political and moral practices, humanly viewed." And he subsequently and repeatedly remarks that, quote, "The pragmatic conception of truth places upon men the responsibility for surrendering political and moral dogmas and subjecting to the test of consequences their most cherished prejudices. Such a charge involves a great change in the seat of authority and the methods of decision in society," to close quote. Now, when we pursue the implications of such observations, it becomes clear that pragmatism endorses experimentation in the various domains of social life. And as I'll argue now, it entails a close relationship between social experimentalism and democracy as a method of collective governance. Now, we can begin to understand the relationship between social experimentalism and democracy by focusing on the concern with effectiveness in policymaking and institutional choice. In The Priority of Democracy, Jim and I set out the following account of how societies will go about the process of establishing and maintaining social institutions. Any modern society can avail itself of a plurality or range of feasible institutional forms. In addition to markets and democratic decision-making procedures, this includes, but it's not limited to, bureaucracy, adjudication through courts, private associations, economic hierarchies, social norms. And of course, these institutional mechanisms, which come in different varieties or forms themselves, also need to be combined in various ways into what we could call institutional arrangements. Once we recognize this plurality of alternatives, the task of choosing which institutions would best coordinate our social interactions in any particular setting appears quite daunting. This in turn raises the difficult task of discerning how in such circumstances any socially diverse group, with their diverse and often conflicting interests, values, and commitments, might determine which array of institutional forms to use to coordinate their ongoing interactions across various social domains. It is in any case likely that members of the population in question will disagree pointedly and legitimately on this matter. So determining which institutional arrangement is appropriate for which purpose turns out to be a very complex task. As standard textbook accounts make clear in the case of markets, economic markets, for example, any form of institution will operate effectively and thus generate normatively attractive outcomes only under particular and in principle specifiable conditions. Not only is it the case that the effectiveness with which any institution operates will be a function of the extent to which these conditions in fact obtain, but it's also the case that their effectiveness may well be a function of social and cultural norms that characterize any particular society. Thus, in any particular context, the task of institutional creation involves not only the selection of one among several available institutional alternatives, but also the identification of mechanisms needed to monitor whether the conditions necessary for effectiveness are being adequately fostered and sustained. The point is general. It doesn't apply only to the selection or design of economic institutions. The effectiveness of any type of institution will be a function in large part of the conditions in which it operates. This remains obscured in many instances because social scientists and other scholars have undertaken considerably less systematic analysis of the preconditions for the effective performance of institutions like democracy, bureaucracy, or judicial decision-making than has been undertaken on economic transactions in the markets. So the point is, we know a lot more about the preconditions of markets working effectively than we know about democracy or courts or these kinds of things. Nonetheless, the task of institutionalizing more centralized arrangements requires that we make a commitment to establishing and maintaining our best understanding of the conditions that make bureaucracy or democratic governance or courts effective in achieving the goals that we impute to them. This obviously places a considerable burden on the members of any society in terms of information and knowledge about institutional performance and effects. On our account, this is where experimentalism emerges as central to politics. Institutional experimentation is a useful instrument for generating knowledge about the effectiveness of institutions in various social contexts. Theoretical analysis can make important contributions to our understandings of issues of institutional performance, but it alone cannot provide definitive answers to questions regarding the actual effects of adopting one or another institution. Such knowledge will reliably emerge only from the cumulative experience of using the various institutions at our disposal. We thus need to be able to rely on the lessons such experience affords us. In the end, we trust or value experimental outcomes insofar as they emerge under proper conditions, and therefore we must expend considerable effort in establishing and monitoring those conditions. Now, the importance of proper conditions highlights the fact that experimentalism is itself an institutional choice. To foster and maintain these conditions, we require some kind of institutional framework of monitoring and assessment. But here, the logic of institutional experimentation starts to resemble an infinite regress, right? So we have institutions and conditions, and then we have meta-institutions and meta-conditions, and there's always got to be some other mechanism for assessing the effectiveness of the conditions of the previous institutions. Yet in this way, it nonetheless clarifies the task before us. To avoid the regress, we have to identify some institutional arrangement or set of arrangements that can serve as a mechanism for 1, coordinating effective institutional experimentation, 2, monitoring and assessing effective institutional performance for the range of institutions that we have available to us, and most importantly, 3rd, monitoring and assessing its own ongoing performance. So is there an institution that can serve the function of assessing the effectiveness of all the other institutions while at the same time assessing its own effectiveness? To properly understand what a focus on the conditions of effectiveness entails, it's helpful to think for a moment about the underlying causal mechanisms that drive experimentalism. And here, I want to argue that the key to understanding social experimentalism from a pragmatic perspective is to properly understand how experimentalism taps into the benefits of social diversity. More specifically, we need to understand the way that social diversity interacts with an important mechanism of social aggregation, competition. Now, I want to stop now and caution you to not think about competition just in the negative connotations that we would tend to think about that term. Because what I want to try to persuade you of, that forms of competition tend to form the basis of most of the institutions that we have available to us, whether it's courts or democratic decision-making or markets or these kinds of things. Competition enters into social life in many forms. Economic competition within a market framework is the standard form, and that tends to be what we think about when we're thinking about the term. But similar forms of competition, like electoral competition, or other forms of competition for political advantage, commonly are incorporated into virtually every conception of democracy. There also is the type of competition facilitated by the adversarial process in most legal systems. We rely on notions of competition when we invoke metaphors like the marketplace of ideas, sort of a standard metaphor, to describe forms of social inquiry. And we rely on the conception of competition when we make claims about the value of experimentation in science, as well as other aspects of social life. What is striking about each of these examples is that they trade on much the same underlying logic. When effective, competition basically involves a process of experimentation and testing. The standard justification for many of our basic legal, political, and economic institutions are grounded in the idea that better decisions follow from a process by which individuals contribute their individual knowledge to collective activity. In the process of contributing their knowledge, individuals test the merits of their own ideas and beliefs, as well as the ideas and beliefs of others. Such institutionalized testing provides a collective understanding that is superior to that previously held by any individual member of the group. With this superior knowledge base, better solutions to collective problems do become possible. The outcome may be better goods and services, better political representation, better policies, better ideas, etc., depending upon the particular case, but the process of achieving it is very much the same, at least in terms of the logic. This is where diversity plays a fundamental role. For the various accounts of competition and its virtues invoke some process by which the distributed knowledge in a society is employed to achieve socially beneficial goals. Competition depends on its effectiveness fundamentally on two features. The first, diversity of inputs, whether these entrants to the competitive process be ideas, individual or collective actors, or institutions and practices. And second, an institutionalized process of experimentation, inquiry, and testing. Diversity is, on this view of the circumstances of politics, a simple social fact. From a pragmatist perspective, this fact takes on normative significance that derives from the contribution diversity makes to processes of experimentation. First, insofar as experimentation consists in processes of problem solving by trial and error, diversity of inputs is in some sense definitional. Experimentation simply presupposes an array of alternatives, an array of possibilities to any given problem, and diversity of perspectives will enhance that range. Second, diversity contributes to experimentation in ways other than by generating proposals. It also is necessary to the sort of robust criticism and challenge that experimental testing demands. Diverse perspectives will help generate a range of objections that in turn will compel relevant actors to reconsider or further justify the solutions they favor for any given problem. This, of course, is a dynamic process in which those who press objections will be compelled to rethink their own views by the responses that their criticisms elicit. In this sense, diversity should increase the confidence with which all decision makers either accept or repudiate any of the particular solutions on offer. This brings me to an important normative implication of pragmatism. In an interdependent, indeterminate world where even our most firmly held beliefs might prove mistaken or misguided in the face of unforeseen contingencies, institutional arrangements that can exploit the virtues of diversity will be more likely to generate better social and political outcomes than arrangements that cannot. This is simply the manner in which the pragmatist, consequentialist commitments manifest themselves in the assessment of institutions and policies. Here, the diversity of inputs requirement recommends diversity of participation. The greater the diversity of participation by people of different backgrounds and experiences, the greater the range of ideas and information contributed to the institutional process. Successful experimentation and testing requires variation, and this variation is a product of diversity of participation. But diversity of participation alone won't guarantee the effectiveness of competition. The condition of effective experimentation and testing thus entails procedural constraints on those extraneous factors that would distort the test of information and ideas. For example, testing procedures should not consider characteristics of an individual unrelated to the quality of his or her ideas and beliefs. So the focus is on the ideas, the focus is on the beliefs and the proposals, and not on the people introducing them. Therefore, the overall effectiveness of the competitive mechanism is a function of our ability to identify and satisfy these conditions, the requirements of diversity and the requirement of effective experimentation and testing. Such an experimental posture exploits the virtues of diversity and promises decentralized control to the extent that various groups might well adopt different institutional mechanisms to cope with the same or very similar problems. However, pragmatists also recognize that both diversity and decentralization are susceptible to the baleful effects of asymmetrical distributions of power, and so insist that for experimentalism to be effective, it must be constrained by certain social and institutional conditions. The importance of these conditions will become apparent when I briefly consider the linkage between pragmatists' commitments to experimentalism and the conception of community that they endorse. So let me turn to that now. In considering the linkages, I could adopt a number of possible characterizations of community. For my purposes here, I want to place the primary emphasis on the mechanisms that characterize social interactions within communities. Thus, on this account, community consists in decentralized, informal arrangements, whether they're rules, roles, values, identities, for coordinating ongoing interactions. Dewey makes it clear here that he has in mind not just this or that extant community, but a regulative ideal, a normative vision of what any existing arrangement might become. And so he explains it as follows, quote, "Associated activity needs no explanation. Things are made that way. But no amount of aggregated collective action itself constitutes a community. For beings who observe and think, and whose ideas are absorbed by impulses and become sentiments and interests, we is as inevitable as I. But we and our exist only when the consequences of combined action are perceived and become an object of desire and effort, just as I and mine appear on the scene only when a distinctive share in mutual action is consciously asserted or claimed. Interactions, transactions, occur de facto, and the results of interdependence follow. But participation in activities and sharing results are additive concerns. They demand communication as a prerequisite." Unquote. Community, then, consists not just in coordinated interaction, but requires the reflexive recognition of participation and its consequences. Informal communities, on this view, like more formal institutions and practices, are instrumental to our coordinated efforts to solve problems that emerge as we navigate the natural and social world. We can appreciate some of the implications of this conception of community, which is fundamental to most pragmatist thinking, by shifting focus from Dewey back to Charles Peirce. The latter was perhaps primarily responsible for the pragmatist's preoccupation with community, insofar as he advanced a conception of belief, knowledge, and truth as grounded in the activities not of individuals, but of communities of inquiry. Among many insights in his discussion, Peirce emphasized the following points that are relevant to this analysis. First, since knowledge and information are a function of experience, the diversity of experience generates what might in contemporary terms be called distributed intelligence. Community establishes boundaries that partition any such distribution, and that thereby constrain and channel the possibilities for the subsequent development of information and knowledge. Second, community is informed by the basic commitment to fallibilism. If any of the beliefs to which an individual subscribes may be erroneous, this will be clearest, just insofar as there are others who are able and willing to point this out. And in most any community I've ever lived in, people have been more than happy to point out whenever I'm wrong about something. So therefore, my experience tends to support that idea. For a pragmatist, therefore, community is characterized by reflexivity, just to the extent that it is a locus of disagreement and conflict. While Dewey has been criticizing for neglecting the pervasive conflict that rends communities, the same cannot be said of Peirce. The dire consequence of pursuing truth by one means rather than another, or of holding to or advancing dissident views, is a pervasive theme in his famous essay, The Fixation of Belief. Those consequences are not, on his view, pretty. Of the method of tenacity, he says the following: when complete agreement could not otherwise be reached, a general massacre of all who have not thought in a certain way has proved a very effective means of settling opinion in a country. Unquote. And of the method of authority, he said, certain nonconformities are permitted, certain others considered unsafe or forbidden. These are different in different countries and in different ages, but wherever you are, let it be known that you seriously hold a tabooed belief, and you may be perfectly sure of being treated with a cruelty less brutal but more refined than hunting you like a wolf. So, a fairly dramatic way of putting it, but nonetheless making the point. Given that he believed that most men, most of the time, are subject to this method of settling belief, this method of authority, it is safe to say that Peirce's assessment is damning. It is safe to say, too, that this hardly amounts to a naive view of how knowledge operates in society. Peirce, of course, advocated what he called the method of science, even if he despaired of the prospects that it would come to govern social relations generally. But the communities of inquiry that do embrace this method of settling belief hardly are diffuse congeries of individuals engaged in uncoordinated endeavors. They inhabit institutions of various sorts that can be assessed in terms of effective performance in generating, disseminating, and verifying knowledge. In this respect, communities of inquiry resemble communities of other sorts in that they are subject to the same vagaries of disagreement and substandard performance. And the existence of disagreement and conflict has important implications for how and in what form such communities emerge. In the earlier book that I talked about some of the arguments yesterday, the Institutions and Social Conflict book, I argued at length that institutions generally emerge as the byproduct of distributional conflicts, marked by some systematic asymmetries of resources and hence of power. Since they're primarily sets of informal institutional arrangements, norms, conventions, and so forth, I would explain the emergence of communities in precisely the same manner. They are, in other words, the more or less arbitrary product of power relations. And this, on my view, has implications for how communities operate. On my view, then, pragmatists should not presume that decentralized communities partition knowledge or structure disagreement in ways that are neutral, efficient, or otherwise collectively beneficial. To the extent that we rely on the informal and decentralized institutional context provided by community to guarantee the conditions under which experimentalism takes place, we will be forced to accept the influence that existing asymmetries of power have over the experimental process itself. These influences can significantly undermine the effectiveness of that process. As I suggested earlier, diversity alone will not guarantee effective competition. These interactions among diverse constituencies must take place in the appropriate institutional setting. Those taking part in experimental processes must be free to, 1, contribute their ideas and beliefs in the input side of the process, and 2, make uncoerced choices as a participant in determining the outcomes of the process. Similarly, the argument for competition as an effective process of experimentation and testing entails constraints on the use of power to perpetuate inequality within the sphere of competition. The overall effectiveness of the process depends fundamentally on our ability to satisfy the conditions of free and equal participation for all members of the relevant community. In The Priority of Democracy, Jim and I argued that the conditions of free and equal participation are complex and relate fundamentally to the opportunity that each individual participant has to influence the experimental process. These conditions place a substantial burden on any society, as it has significant implications for how that society institutionalizes freedom and equality for its citizens. Concerns with practical questions of how we might institutionalize this condition require us to make an important distinction between formal rights to participate and effective opportunities to participate. In the book, we argue that both formal rights and effective opportunity are necessary to establish a context in which the desired effects of experimentalism will obtain. That is, the effective performance of the experimental process is a function of the effectiveness of individual participation. Now, the actual process of applying the criteria of free and equal participation to real social institutions will involve difficult and sometimes controversial decisions. The institutional requirements do not always lend themselves to straightforward implementation and often confront us with trade-offs with other things that we may value. While we have, in the book, we identified that it's hard to sort out exactly what the criteria is going to be of satisfying this condition, we suggest that the task is something like a group maximization problem. So you want to maximize the opportunities for effective participation given our other values, which may sometimes come in conflict there. The emphasis throughout must be on effectiveness, and the focus must be on mitigating the factors that would adversely affect opportunities for influence. Effective freedom and equality raise complex questions for both institutional and policy choice. Now, this characterization, we think, deflects the concerns of those who find the pragmatist analogy between communities of scientific inquiry and political communities too rarefied. Some people make that criticism. Communities of inquiry, like communities of other sorts, are actually, on our view, more or less thoroughly politicized. And like institutions more generally, they confront a severe burden of justification in the sense that absent specifiable initial conditions, a community will not effectively achieve whatever goals or aims its members set for itself. This highlights the need for institutional mechanisms that allow community members to monitor and enforce the sorts of conditions that mitigate the effects of asymmetries of power. Now, this discussion underscores the institutional implications of pragmatism for social experimentalism in particular, and for other forms of social institutions more generally. For pragmatists do not just insist on the need for institutions to coordinate ongoing social and political interactions. That, after all, would be a simple platitude. Pragmatists also understand that social institutions will operate effectively only if particular initial conditions obtain. A pragmatist, on this view then, will further insist upon the need for some institutional mechanism that will enable relevant parties to monitor those conditions, propose remedies when the relevant conditions do not actually obtain, and assess the effectiveness with which particular institutions, in fact, coordinate ongoing interactions across various social domains. Here, it begins to become apparent not only why, on our account, pragmatists will endorse formal institution guarantees for the free and equal protection requirement for social experimentalism, but also why pragmatists will insist that those formal requirements must be democratic in character. For pragmatists, rightly, hold out scant hope that even under idealized conditions, alternative institutional mechanisms like markets, bureaucracies, courts, etc., might effectively accomplish the tasks of monitoring and assessing the conditions of effective experimentalism. Pragmatists thus accord formal democratic institutional mechanisms a strong priority, just insofar as they are able to perform the tasks necessary if those other forms of institutions, and indeed if democratic arrangements themselves, are to operate effectively. This applies to social experimentalism as well as other forms of social activity. Now, this is an argument that we pursue in detail in the priority of democracy. Here, I want merely to emphasize a few aspects of that argument that relates especially to our analysis of social experimentalism. First, I will highlight those features of formal democratic institutions that facilitate the kinds of communication and deliberation essential to the process of social experimentalism. And second, I'm going to raise some issues about the nature of social experimentalism that support the claim that any formal institutional guarantees of the conditions of effectiveness should be democratic in character. And I promise to be brief on that. Democratic decision-making structures competition in such a way as to take special advantage of the benefits of diversity. It does so primarily in terms of the particular way it employs distributed knowledge in a society. Unlike decentralized approaches, Everything okay? Okay. Unlike decentralized approaches, which test a particular idea or good through an ongoing process of small group interactions. So the market works with small exchanges, small group exchanges. Democratic decision-making constructs in principle a more inclusive and comprehensive test for any idea or proposal. The collective nature of the decision-making process forces any idea to face the scrutiny of an expansive array of perspectives, while simultaneously giving each perspective the opportunity to challenge any other feasible alternative. In doing so, democratic institutions attempt to guarantee that resulting collective decisions will be the product of a thorough and comprehensive testing process. In this way, democratic institutions seek to give social diversity the maximal effect on the decision-making process among the feasible set of institutional alternatives. To the extent that diversity can enhance the epistemological basis of social coordination, then this is an asset in the case of democracy. It is a direct product of the salutary effect of political argument on democratic decision-making. Now, we argue in the book and go into detail in talking about three basic ways that political debate enhances democracy. But the one that I want to focus on here, actually briefly, is the third of the three. In this one, the argument runs as follows. Political argument in a democratic decision-making environment will allow for a better reflexivity that is lacking in alternative arrangements. This reflexivity makes democratic institutions especially appropriate for the tasks of coordinating institutional experimentalism and choice. What do we mean when we say that democratic institutions operate in a reflexive manner? The reflexivity of democratic arrangements derives from the fact that political argument, again increasingly so to the extent that it transpires under the appropriate conditions, that political argument requires relevant parties to assert, defend, and revise their own views, and to entertain, challenge, or accept those of others. It's similar to an argument about experimentalism that I made a few minutes ago. It derives, in other words, from ongoing disagreement and conflict. In this respect, democratic institutions clearly different from market interactions, where, in the case of disagreement in the market, parties simply exit to seek more favorable terms of exchange elsewhere, while in cases of agreement, they simply trade without concern for the efficiency or distributive features of the aggregate market outcomes. In this sense, too, it resembles judicial decision-making, where in the ideal, arguments are exchanged under established fair conditions. But in legal settings, too, the parties, judges, juries, the litigants themselves, typically are concerned primarily with settling the case at hand, rather than with either the law as some separate entity, or structure writ large, or with the way established rules will impact the outcomes of future cases. So both in the market and in the courts, people are focused on the particular interaction they're involved in. And part of that involvement does not involve stepping back and reflecting on how the market as a system works, or stepping back and thinking about how courts as a system works. One of the important things that we often try to emphasize is the argument for the effectiveness of markets rests on the idea that you're not reflexive, that you just focus on the information before you and you make the proper exchange and rely on the markets. So in the justification of economic markets, the more you allow for the possibility of reflexive and strategic behavior, the less efficient markets will be. Okay, and so that's an interesting feature of markets. Absolutely the opposite in terms of democracy, in terms of that. All right. For political argument, as opposed to these others, not only allows members of a democratic polity to collectively revisit past substantive decisions, it also allows them to collectively reconsider and revise the terms of their ongoing interactions. Democratic politics, in other words, structures disagreement not just over policy decisions, but also over the operation and reform of social and political institutions. Moreover, because democratic arrangements structure political argument so as to allow the emergence of new ideas, perspectives, and interests, and thereby new constituencies and oppositions, this reflexivity has an endogenous, dynamic dimension. In practical terms, what I want to argue is that it is less useful to characterize political debate as inducing agreement than to see it as structuring disagreement. Because in thinking about democracy, I would argue that it's a mistake to focus on the agreement. You should instead keep your eye on the conflict. That's because even when political argument succeeds in establishing a shared assessment of the relevant dimensions of conflict, so that it leaves considerable space for persistent disagreement. Just because you lose today doesn't mean you're not going to reconsider that decision down the line. Okay? And allows you, democratic decision making allows you the possibility to do that. So the grounds for the claims that we made in the book that democracy is reflexive then emerge when we see how, when it is successful, political debate structures disagreement and thereby potentially fosters still further disagreement. The irreducible diversity of interests, commitments, and attachments that give rise to politics in the first place means that members of a population have an interest in monitoring the institutions that coordinate their ongoing interactions. Because democratic institutions afford space for disagreement, they also provide the agents who populate them with ample opportunity to challenge the terms of their ongoing interactions. There's little reason to suspect, as I suggest, that such space will remain vacant for long. Those individuals and groups who lose in political competition, who are newly emergent, who have remained in opposition, become the agents of democratic reflexivity. Now, the capacity of democratic institutional arrangements to better exploit the benefits of social diversity and to facilitate reflexivity in the monitoring and assessment process justifies a certain priority for democracy. The priority applies to the tasks of establishing and maintaining the conditions of institutional effectiveness in social life. It applies for all social institutions, just as it applies to the process of social experimentalism. So there's an important pragmatic reason for requiring that the conditions of effectiveness for social experimentalism be guaranteed by formal democratic institutional arrangements. And it is especially important that they be democratic when we take account of some of the implications of the practice of social experimentalism. In closing, let me just mention two. The first being the individual and social costs of experimentalism, and the second, the inevitable political dimension of social experimentalism. Talk about costs first. Although pragmatism gives priority to experimentalism and inquiry, it also requires us to take account of other factors, including the consequences of experimentation itself. Any form of social experimentation brings with it costs. Pragmatists understand that they should be sensitive to these costs and consider them in assessing the merits of any new policy proposal. The consequences of experimentation can extend beyond the circumstances of a particular social activity and affect social relationships in other related areas. The costs might be substantial and they can take many forms. We can see what is at stake here by briefly considering two costs that introduce potential obstacles to this approach to experimentation. On the account that I've presented here, pragmatism undergirds a specific approach to social decision-making. Thus, a commitment to pragmatism entails not only a willingness to participate in the process of inquiry, but also a basic commitment to abide and accept the policy implications of that process. But what will enter into the individual decision, the decision of a particular individual whether to participate and comply? The first issue underscores the importance of stable expectations, and as such, it is essential to pragmatism's own concern about the value of individual autonomy. Central to the pragmatist vision is the idea that individuals should have the autonomy whenever possible to realize their self-chosen life plans. One of the necessary conditions for such self-realization is stability in our expectations as to how the world works around us, including, most importantly, how others will behave in their interactions with us. The stability of social expectations is always in tension with experimentation, since experimentation creates social uncertainty and challenges, at least temporarily, our existing beliefs. Put this way, experimentation at the societal level appears to complicate self-realization at the individual level. This highlights one of the ongoing tensions societies face when they set out to address questions of institutional choice. There's no principled way of permanently resolving the question of experimentation and change versus stability. It is rather a factor that must be addressed in the decision-making process itself, for it forces pragmatists to confront the basic question of how much experimentation, with its attendant uncertainty and potential instability, individual members of society will be willing to accept. The second issue relates to distribution of the costs of experimentation among the individual members of society. Pragmatists understand that institutional experimentalism is justified primarily in terms of its value for social decision-making, in that sense, collective decision-making, and emphasizes both the collective and mutual benefits of such inquiry. But they may also take account of the personal calculations of costs and benefits in which individuals might engage before making a decision about their willingness to participate. And thus the distribution of costs among the members of society becomes a relevant consideration. There's good reason to believe that left unchecked, the costs will be borne disproportionately by relatively disadvantaged participants. One important reason is that in any diverse society, existing resource asymmetries will tend to disproportionately distribute both the ability and the willingness of differentially situated participants to bear the costs of such experimentation. A second significant reason is that the very nature of experimentation in societies, in large populations, will likely generate a range of relatively small-scale experiments, each of which is aimed in part to produce lessons for the society at large. This structure of experimentation forms the basis of many of the normative justifications of federalism, as I suggested earlier, as a governance mechanism. In such circumstances, some will succeed and some will fail, and the costs will fall on participants in the failed undertakings. That's such as the nature of experimentalism. Any asymmetrical distribution of costs or burdens clearly raises normative concerns regarding equity. Given the primary emphasis on the social nature of institutional experimentation, basic principles of equity suggest no particular social group should disproportionately bear the risks associated with experimentation. In addition to such normative concerns, there are the practical implications related to the importance of diverse participation in the experimental process. As I have suggested, experimentation relies on diversity both in inputs and in assessment of quality. Costs affect the incentives for individual participation. Therefore, pragmatists will be concerned to maintain the incentives necessary for diverse participation throughout the process. We want people to participate in the process, and so therefore these costs have to be taken account of. The distribution of costs is another factor that pragmatists will incorporate into the experimental equation. One of the virtues of the approach of democratic experimentalism that I defended here is that it recognizes the central importance of establishing an institutional framework that allows those who will bear the potential costs of experimentation to monitor the conditions under which it takes place. Finally, the last point is related to the political nature of social experimentation. And this is a problem faced by pragmatists. Pragmatists view the results of experimental inquiry as hypotheses, revisable in light of social experience and political debate. Dewey understands the scope of experimentalism broadly, emphasizing the place in experiment of comprehensive social ideas as working hypotheses in direction of action, unquote. Such inquiry presupposes not only impartial investigation, but also free and extensive communication of results. As Dewey remarks, knowledge is communication as well as understanding. For a pragmatist, the results of social inquiry cannot be applied mechanically to social and political problems. Pragmatists are not committed to social engineering. They insist instead that the results of inquiry must enter into social and political deliberation and debate rather than be merely applied to problems. This is a broad and somewhat vague demand. However, it captures at least two important constraints on social inquiry. The first constraint is that the results of social inquiry typically do not unambiguously support any specific policy proposal or course of political action. They require interpretation and discussion, and in that sense, inquiry, and especially what relevant agents might infer from the results of inquiry, leaves considerable room for disagreement. The second constraint is that improved understanding of practices and institutions can enter reflexively into the ways that social and political agents participate in those very practices. Policy and institutional choice itself is a function of the outcomes produced by the social interactions that take place within the context of social institutions. On this pragmatist view, social relations consist simply in ongoing interactions that need to be coordinated in an effective way. And we appraise and compare institutions in light of our expectations regarding which will most effectively facilitate that task, where the criteria of effectiveness in turn are specified in terms of social consequences. This is a very important point and often troubling for this pragmatist argument. For a pragmatist, the criterion of best in terms of what's the most effective or best outcome in the way of assessing any social practice depends upon the specific circumstances of the particular interaction. This is where the inherently political nature of social inquiry and experimentation comes into focus. For, unlike utilitarianism or other variants of consequentialism grounded in some foundational criterion of assessment, pragmatism rejects the notion that there is one single metric that forms the basis of policy and institutional choice. Rather, a number of factors might come into play in assessing the consequences of such a choice. Some people may favor efficiency. Others might give priority to equality, or fairness, or distributive justice. Some might place the emphasis on long-term stability. Others might advocate the benefits of fluidity and change. And some might insist on the importance of the effects on freedom of choice or empowerment, while others might place greater emphasis on the collective benefits derived from constraining choice in particular circumstances, and so on and so on. Only rarely, moreover, is it likely that any participant will wholly discount the importance of any of the criteria we've just mentioned. Usually people are going to be interested in more than one of these things, and they're going to try to figure out ways to balance them in making these assessments. In the face of what they see as reasonable disagreement, pragmatists believe that there is no ex-ante way to resolve these differences and tensions. And so they conclude that the criterion of such choices must be determined by those who are involved in the relevant social interaction in accordance with their own interests, attachments, and commitments. That is, the participants themselves must determine what constitutes the best consequence in any particular situation. In doing so, they must balance the various factors by which they assess the relevant consequences and derive a workable standard for particular cases. Hence, the political nature of the experimental process. The main implication here is that the processes of social experimentation themselves require an institutional framework to facilitate and help resolve disagreements over what counts as best. This is an important aspect of the more general task of institutionalizing processes of social experimentalism. Even under ideal conditions, there's no reason to expect consensus on such matters as how to weight competing normative criteria or how to judge whether empirical conditions sufficiently approach those necessary to make likely, let alone ensure, normatively attractive outcomes. The fact of pluralism suggests that there will always be space for legitimate disagreement about such matters. And most importantly, politics extends to the comprehensive task of institutionalizing the experimental process itself. Given both the trade-offs that must often be addressed and the conflicts generated by the diversity of values in any society, the process of defining the legitimate boundaries of effective social experimentation will inevitably be a political one. In the end, there is a tension here that is subject to constant negotiation and reconsideration. A tension between the inherently political nature of the institutionalization process and the social and institutional preconditions that must obtain for that very process to be considered effective. Given the way that democratic decision-making procedures can effectively facilitate cooperation in the face of ongoing conflict, They seem especially well suited to handle the intricacies of social experimentalism.
Well, thank you very much, Professor. All right.